Allen Lund Company looks forward to seeing you at Matt's in March.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Redding.
California's aggressive push to electrify commercial motor vehicles in the state has hit a roadblock. And that's welcome news to Eric Sawyer, CEO of the California Trucking Association. He provides us with an update on that, along with the controversial California worker classification law called AB 5, the Los Angeles wildfires, and more. Also on today's program, members of the U.S. Senate will spend some time this week on two issues that have significant importance to the trucking industry, the actual infrastructure as well as cargo theft. And the time spent on both issues may be part of the lead-up to something much bigger. I'll find out what's planned, what we expect, and why it's all important from Bryce Mungen of OOIDA's Washington, D.C. office. But first, the news with Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. New details tonight about New York City's congestion pricing plan. A spokesperson for Governor Kathy Hochul said in a statement that the governor met with President Trump at the White House late last week to discuss the controversial plan. Congestion pricing went into place in Manhattan's Central Business District on January 5th. Last week, however, the Federal Highway Administration revoked its approval of the plan, although tolling remains in place for now. NY1 reports that Governor Hochul showed the president a 22-page presentation that touted the program's success over its first month in operation. Meanwhile, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy told CBS News last week that his department is not opposed to a congestion pricing plan, but said he wants the issue studied more.
And so the American taxpayer, the New York taxpayer, funded those streets. And the way the governor set this up is, she said, even though you already paid for these streets, you can't use those streets unless you pay an additional toll. Well, if I'm the taxpayer, I'm like, I already paid for the street. Why am I paying an additional toll to the taxes I already paid? There's no free pathway into that cordoned area, right? So if you're a middle income or a lower income shopper or worker, you can't access public roads by any means into this area. That's flat out wrong. And we've never had a program like that where there's not a free public road to get in to a certain area.
That's especially true of commercial truck drivers who have little control over their schedules or routes. Under the current congestion pricing plan, truckers driving a multi-unit truck with an Easy Pass are charged $21.60 during the peak period each time they enter the congestion pricing zone with no daily cap. President Trump's cost-cutting advisory group led by Elon Musk has reportedly eliminated positions at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that are responsible for overseeing Tesla. NHTSA has several open investigations into Tesla's partially automated vehicles following several incidents on U.S. roadways. In a statement, NHTSA said it had cut a modest amount of positions within the agency. When asked whether the cuts would affect any of the investigations into Tesla, the agency said it will enforce a law on all manufacturers of motor vehicles and equipment. New data confirms what we already knew about cross-border freight in 2024. It was a record year. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics says truck freight valued at nearly $78 billion was hauled across the borders in December. That's up 6% compared with a year earlier, but down 6% from the previous month. Mexican truck freight led the way in December, spiking 10%, while Canadian freight was up by less than 1%. The hike in Mexican truck movement was led by a 54% surge in computer-related imports, which was a theme for all of 2024. Interstate 40 between North Carolina and Tennessee is set to partially reopen this weekend. The stretch of road has been shut down since September following damage caused by Hurricane Helene. One lane in each direction of I-40 will reopen by this coming Saturday, March 1st. State officials, including North Carolina Secretary of Transportation Joey Hopkins, recently made the announcement during a news conference.
We're here to the end. We want to see it to the end. We're happy that we can open I-40 here in a couple of weeks, and that's certainly going to help commerce and help travel between North Carolina and Tennessee. And we can continue working on the rest of the routes until we get those done too.
Some restrictions will be in place once that stretch of I-40 reopens. Standard-sized trucks will be allowed. Oversized loads will not. A permanent rebuild to I-40 is expected to begin soon. More than 50 routes are still closed to truck traffic due to damage caused by Helene, and more than 150 roads remain closed to all traffic. Traffic is once again moving through Interstate 80's Green River Tunnel in Wyoming. The tunnel was shut down following a deadly crash and fire that happened earlier this month. On Thursday, the Wyoming Department of Transportation opened up the eastbound lanes for traffic moving both directions. But take care if you're heading that way. The speed limit has been reduced to 35 miles an hour through the tunnel. Plan for delays. Meanwhile, work continues on the westbound side of the tunnel as crews work to clear the area and evaluate its safety. TFI International is moving. The carrier said in a news release that it plans to relocate its headquarters from Montreal to somewhere in the United States. TFI has operated in the U.S. since 2011 and has traded on the New York Stock Exchange since February of 2020. The company says about 70% of its operations are currently based in the U.S. Police in Greenwich, Connecticut, handing out thousands of dollars in fines on one day last week during a CMV enforcement blitz. Several vehicles were stopped. One vehicle was placed out of service. Greenwich police say more than $11,000 in fines were issued. Arizona drivers, be on your best behavior this week. Law enforcement throughout the state are participating in a week-long enforcement blitz aimed at commercial motor vehicles. It's called Operation Southern Shield. The blitz will run through Friday with officers placing an emphasis on commercial vehicles traveling on Interstate 10 between Phoenix and New Mexico and on Interstate 19 between Tucson and the southern border. They'll be looking for any sort of violation from safety regulations and hours of service violations to distracted driving, seatbelt and moving violations, and more. Police in one North Texas town are cracking down on commercial vehicles traveling through the city. The city of Melissa last week announced the start of an initiative officials say is aimed at the safety of all drivers and protecting city roadways from excessive wear and tear. As part of the initiative, officers will conduct more frequent inspections of commercial vehicles traveling the city's roads. Weight and equipment checks will be part of those inspections. So will hours of service compliance and anything else that pops up. And finally, the Truckload Carriers Association and Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund are looking for volunteers to haul the Wall That Heals, a mobile replica of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The 3/4 scale replica of the wall and a mobile education center travel the country, honoring those who made the ultimate sacrifice in Vietnam and the millions of others who served. Drivers and/or trucking companies are needed to volunteer to haul the Wall That Heals to a single event or to multiple locations. Organizers say it's one of the most important deliveries you'll ever make. For more information, we have a link on our website at landlinenow.com. And that's Landline Now News for today. I'm Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Scott. Congratulations to Garfield Harper Jr. of West Hampton, New Jersey. He's received the OOIDA Safe Driving Award for 19 years of safe, accident-free driving. That's the equivalent of a car driver going 143 years without causing a single accident. The OOIDA Safe Driving Award program is sponsored by Shell Rotella. And if you're interested in receiving the Safe Driving Award, you can find a link to more information on our website, landlinenow.com. Again, that website, landlinenow.com. Starting Tuesday, Marty Ellis and OOIDA's tour truck, The Spirit of the American Trucker, will be at the TA Express in Jonesboro, Arkansas. That's located at Exit 39 on Interstate 555. Stop in, say hi to Marty, and join OOIDA for a $10 discount. Freight fraud has become one of the most urgent problems in the trucking industry, and a lot of people listening to this have likely been affected. Now, members of Congress are paying attention. Two bills, S-337 in the Senate and H.R. 880 in the House, would give FMCSA the power to fight freight fraud. Contact your lawmakers either by calling 202-224-3121 or by going to fightingfortruckers.com. Next, Scott Thompson covers California's push to electrify trucks and more with Eric Sawyer of the California Trucking Association, and I'll discuss an upcoming Senate hearing on infrastructure and cargo theft with Bryce Mungen of OOIDA's Washington, D.C. office. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Capital Reman, the leader in remanufactured diesel engines and components, has partnered with OOIDA to offer exclusive member benefits. Visit capitalreman.com today to support America's transportation industry and take advantage of your benefits.
Running on ultra-low sulfur diesel? Stay protected this winter with Howe's Diesel Treat and Diesel Lifeline. Steer clear of gel and ice with North America's #1 trusted brand. Find Howe's products nationwide at select retailers, auto parts stores, truck stops, and on Amazon.com.
It's tested and proven. Burn 2.1% less fuel when you balance all wheel ends with Centromatic. Call 800-523-8473 to get the OOIDA discount.
Landline Now, welcome back. The sheer amount of regulations placed on truckers in California can be a lot to digest, and that's why trucking industry stakeholders are celebrating some recent victories in the Golden State. One person that describes Eric Sauer, CEO of the California Trucking Association. He's been on the front lines of the fight against strict emission standards, AB5, and more, and he joins us now for an update. Eric, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. Really appreciate being on.
So I want to start by asking about the wildfires in Los Angeles. I think we as a nation tend to kind of have a short attention span when it comes to these types of things, but I know the people there are affected. The people there affected are facing a long recovery. How are you and everyone else doing out there?
Yeah, first off, and I appreciate the question. First off, obviously our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of the fire and just terrible situation down south a little over a month ago. But it's unfortunate situation in California. Unfortunately, we see over the last, I don't know how many years, it is, fire season is longer. And you have these types of situations where there's just tremendous destruction that is happening that, impacts everybody, and not just the trucking industry, but everybody, being able to, move or get around these impacted areas, and then the extensive time it takes to rebuild these areas, get it cleaned up and go through all that process. And now you're seeing a lot of the delays in the permitting issues, the delays in the cleanup, and delays of people actually being able to get back to their houses and get back to some sense of normalcy. And it's just unfortunate. You see it more and more. And the trucking industry is very resilient. What we've seen with the industry in response to these types of tragedies or unfortunate destructive fires is, these trucking, a lot of trucking companies and truckers are very community oriented, and they do so much for their community. I've just been blown away over the years at how giving the industry is. And this is the community that they live in. These are the communities that they, deliver to, and the amount of free equipment, donated equipment, trailers, tractors, drivers, products that the industry is, always willing and able to provide in response to these things is just, very, it makes me feel good that I'm representing such a fantastic industry.
Yeah, you said the trucking community is resilient at one point there, and I was going to follow up to say that the trucking community is also very generous. When we see things happen like this, they're one of the first people or groups of people there to respond to whatever has happened, and you kind of you went right into that. So yeah, that's the video and pictures coming out of LA are just devastating, and it's good to see the people that are helping out there actually doing that and giving back a little bit. On the business side of things, we've got a lot to talk about here because there's been a lot.
California, so
that's true.
We could be here for hours, and
we'll try to.
It's like It's like a therapy session.
Yeah.
So.
Well, lie down on the couch for us. Let's go over it here and talk about it.
Got my feet up on the desk as we speak.
There you go. Well, let's start with all the latest emissions developments that have happened in your state, and there have been a number of new developments there. And I guess we can start with the state of California withdrawing Advanced Clean Fleets, its electric truck mandate. I'm not going to put words in your mouth here, but I imagine you and the association are quite pleased with that development. Yeah,
I like to compare it to, I'm a big football fan, and, when you see someone score the touchdown and they either do the celebration or, you see the guy just handing the football to the ref. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of where we are is, yes, absolutely great news that they withdrew the waiver, but also, be cautiously optimistic because this is California and we understand where they want to go. I think that a couple things with, the withdrawal of the waiver. One, obviously the new administration, CARB firmly believed that it was not going to get granted by, the EPA was not going to grant the waiver. So number one. But also number two, I think it's a reflection of just how, what we've been saying all along, and part of the litigation that we filed on it was just that this regulation was doomed from the start. And, I think my first interview with you, when the regulation was approved, I think I called it Fantasyland. With respect to what, it was going on with the recent granting of the waiver and the upcoming Advanced Clean Fleet Rule, that's what I like to call Fantasyland. Both are unachievable and unrealistic.
That was Eric back in the spring of 2023, shortly after the EPA gave the state of California the green light to implement regulations that would have required half of all new heavy-duty vehicles to be electric by the year 2035. That's the very same waiver that California recently withdrew upon realizing that the then incoming Trump administration would likely take a sledgehammer to the deal altogether. Again, this is Eric Sauer from 2023, explaining how the upcoming requirements would have put a squeeze on truck drivers who are just trying to make a living.
Yeah, it's very problematic. This is, kind of what we've been calling Fantasyland. These are, we've been working with our members on this for 6 to 7 years, been talking with them and talking with the Air Resources Board on realistic goals and approaches on the transition to zero-emission trucks, which, for right now, you're seeing a lot of these vehicles being piloted and tested. And we actually put together a working group that had a lot of the national carriers involved. And these are the fleets and the carriers that, if there's anybody that's in a position to transition their fleet over time to zero-emission trucks, they were even telling CARB that there's no chance that we can meet this aggressive requirement schedule for the rule. And we had proposed some options that were realistic, and after presenting those to CARB, it just there was no response, and it was full steam ahead.
The frustration you hear in Eric's voice has not gone away, but it's now accompanied by a bit more hope given recent events. But it does also beg the question, where do we go from here? Here's Eric Sauer again, but back in present day.
And there's just so many moving parts that were included in this regulation. And essentially, when you're mandating an industry to comply with a regulation, and there's lack of equipment there and lack of infrastructure to support that equipment or technology, it's doomed from the start. And there's, the requirements that were imposed on the industry. And I've always said this, this isn't a knock on the technology. The technology is getting there. It's getting better, but there's a lot of things that have to get addressed to make sure that it works for the industry. And that takes time. And under these, time frame that CARB, put in this unrealistic regulation, were just they were unachievable. I always like, whenever I talk to someone about this, it's more of an education with the public that that's the audience you want to talk about. Because a lot of people think like, oh, well, I see all these Teslas and EVs driving around and there's charging stations all over the place for these things. It's a lot different for the industry. You're talking a heavier, battery. So the bigger the battery, the heavier the vehicle is going to be and the longer the charge is going to be. And so, right there's those limitations about that. But the supporting infrastructure, which, people don't really understand the process to get charging brought in, charging, facilities or retail facilities. You don't see a charging retail facility like you do with gas stations.
Right.
The network just isn't there. And obviously, the build out at some point will be more robust. But the number I always like to use is California to, basically make this work for the trucking industry. You would have had to put 300 DC chargers in the ground per week to be able to meet the demand or meet the vehicles that were falling under compliance with the regulation. And I don't think we have, I don't know if there's 300 out there already. So, between that and the cost of bringing in, electricity to charge these vehicles, the time it takes to bring in enough juice to charge the industry. I mean, it's astronomical, the cost alone. And another data point that we use a lot is to charge the entire industry would take up 40% of California's grid. So 40% going to one industry. That's kind of a telling number that, well, this thing's just a little bit too unrealistic. It's just maybe we got to pump the brakes on it.
Yeah, you talk about educating the people. I think educating the policymakers and the lawmakers who come up with these things is equally, or if not more important as well when we're talking about all this. I like the analogy you used there at the top of what you were saying about football, about, it doesn't sound like you're celebrating right now. You're kind of subscribing to the Barry Sanders, the Detroit Lions, legend.
One of the best. Yeah.
Just handing the ball over, because I get the sense that you feel the game is not over. I get the sense that you feel like more is going to be coming here down the pike. Is that accurate?
Yeah, correct. And it's, really too early to speculate in what form or fashion that's going to be, but it's California. We understand where where they want to go with the transition to electric vehicles. And it's, our approach is let's work on something that's like realistic, something that is workable. Maybe, let's start, piloting certain projects or, making something that makes sense for just not the industry, but also the public as well, because, these vehicles are 3-4 times more expensive than a diesel truck. And so you got to factor in these costs. You also have to factor in the costs of bringing in the electricity into facilities and how much that's going to cost. And, that's not going to be borne by the trucker.
Yeah.
Most of these truckers are just, they don't own the product. They're just transporting the product. And so then they have to go to their customers and say, hey, I'm going to need a little bit more to be able to transport your products because I'm being, mandated to buy these trucks. And what do you think happens after that? You think their customer is just going to absorb that cost? No, they're going to pass the cost on to you and I and the public. So there's all these things, that have to kind of come in line, or is the public prepared to pay a lot more for their goods and services? I don't think the public would really embrace that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Kind of folding into this conversation, we've got the EPA now moving to rescind Biden administration era waivers for California's advanced clean trucks, the heavy-duty omnibus regulations. They're looking at some fixes there that actually would put up pretty big barriers toward introducing these things again, even in a future administration. Again, I know it's kind of folded into what we're talking about here, but I think the main point is that there are lawmakers and policymakers out there who are trying to, kind of put those barriers up here moving forward. I'm sure you've been following those as well. Do you feel like that's more of a, I suppose, long-term solution to these mandates that keep popping up time and time again when they are not realistic, as we talk right now?
Yeah, I think I don't want to say it's a long-term solution, but definitely I think when obviously the way the process works, the feds set the baseline. And then if a state wants, and it's usually California, wants to come in and kind of tighten that or make it more restrictive or, go beyond what the feds have set, that's where you have to go through this process.
We'll put a pin in our conversation with Eric Sauer, CEO of the California Trucking Association, while we step aside to pay some bills. But when we come back, we'll hear more of Eric's thoughts on emission standards, plus an update on the fight against AB5 and more. So hang tight. We're back right after this.
Are you tired of the IRS following you around like a dark cloud? Call 888-557-4020 and get your life back.
At Truck Stop, we've built a better load board for carriers like you. Sign up today and access over 600,000 loads on the most trusted online load board. Learn why the best in the business rely on Truck Stop to make more money and start driving your profit today.
Landline now, welcome back. When we last left you, we were talking with Eric Sauer, CEO of the California Trucking Association, about the aggressive moves in the state to implement strict emission standards. The pushback in recent weeks has been just as aggressive. and the EPA and Congress are now trying to make sure the measures go away for good. We'll pick it back up there with Eric before getting into AB5 and more.
Most of these truckers are just, they don't own the product. They're just transporting the product. And so then they have to go to their customers and say, hey, I'm going to need a little bit more to be able to transport your products because I'm being, mandated to buy these trucks. And what do you think happens after that? You think their customer is just going to absorb that cost? No, they're going to pass the cost on to you and I and the public. So there's all these things, that have to kind of come in line, or is the public prepared to pay a lot more for their goods and services? I don't think the public would really embrace that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Kind of folding into this conversation, we've got the EPA now moving to rescind Biden administration era waivers for California's advanced clean trucks, the heavy duty omnibus regulations. They're looking at some fixes there that actually would put up pretty big barriers toward introducing these things again, even in a future administration. I know it's kind of folded into what we're talking about here, but I think the main point is that there are lawmakers and policymakers out there who are trying to, kind of put those barriers up here moving forward. I'm sure you've been following those as well. Do you feel like that's more of a, I suppose, long-term solution to these mandates that keep popping up time and time again when they are not realistic, as we talk right now?
Yeah, I think I don't want to say it's a long-term solution, but definitely I think when obviously the way the process works, the feds set the baseline. And then if a state wants, and it's usually California, wants to come in and kind of tighten that or make it more restrictive or, go beyond what the feds have set, that's where you have to go through this process. And I think, if you're looking at, we've always advocated against these patchwork of regulations because the industry obviously drives into multiple states, hence interstate commerce. And so, the patchwork of different states and their different plans or regulations, and, a lot of these states don't have the emission or, they're not in compliance as far as air quality, following California's lead when they don't have the struggles California does. I mean, that all that does is hurt that state as well. So, obviously we're keeping an eye on these things. We been talking closely with our, the American Trucking Associations and just seeing what's going on there. But it seems like kind of a movement on let's kind of come up with some more realistic approaches on these things. The industry understands nationally where a lot of these states and policymakers, regulators, and where they want to go with the transition to EV. It's been coming for years. And for us in California, immediately following the on-road truck and bus rule, we were educating our members on, hey, this is going to be coming, the movement of, transitioning to an electric vehicle industry, it's going to be coming. So, we constantly would educate and update our members. We developed a working group. That led to the development of our board giving us approval to file litigation on these things. But we always knew that, hey, this is California. We know that a lot of businesses are investing a lot of time and money on piloting and demonstrating this type of technology. But again, like I said before, it has to be a realistic approach and actually an achievable approach. And I always like to bring this up. The day that the regulation or the proposal was released, not the reg, it was not when it was adopted, but when it was proposed, was the same day that Californians were told to not plug their cars in because we were going through it was the summer and we had to save the energy and the grid. And so Californians were being told not to plug their cars in. I think that's a telling sign right there off the bat that, hey, this thing is not ready for prime time. There's a lot of work to be done. Yeah,
the free market will figure this out eventually. But we're not quite there yet. I think that is a very safe thing to say. You spoke about litigation. AB5 is still tied up in litigation. I know the legal challenges remain there. And it's kind of, I think we're in kind of a holding pattern right now in terms of what the courts are going to say about this. But do you have any updates on AB5? What are you seeing and hearing there?
Yeah, so our portion of the litigation ended in 2024, where we decided not to move forward on it. We kind of pivoted to a strategy, and what we're looking at and what we've been working on since that time is we really want to get some clarification on the business-to-business exemption. It's like a labyrinth where you're trying to get this information. I think the regulating agency is, they're aware of this, and so we're working on getting more clarity on how that provision is going to apply to trucking, because what the industry needs, and especially following a regulation or a law, is you need to provide that industry who falls under those clear guidance. If it's confusing, it's not doing anyone any good. And so that's what we're focused on, is we want to make sure that we're getting clarity, not only for our members, but the entire industry. And all we ever asked for was that the worker classification test did not put small business truckers completely out of business, and that there's clarity on what hiring entities and owner-operators are supposed to do to comply with it. And so that's where we're at right now, is trying to get a lot more clarification for the industry to be able to digest and have a clear pathway on how they can comply with AB5.
I'm sure you've brought this up to CARB in the state of California before. We may even have spoken about this the last time we spoke, but raising that point of, if it is so confusing that nobody can follow what they're supposed to be doing, that alone should tell you there's a problem here. I imagine you've raised that with people within CARB and the state, and what do they say to you when you raise that point?
Are you speaking on the ACF or AB5?
AB5 or even ACF, yeah. I suppose, too.
Yeah, so on the AB5, we've had meetings with the DLSE, which, is California's, they're supposed to be providing the guidance on the AB5. And so we've been, having meetings. We've been trying to work with them on providing guidance. Hopefully we'll get some resolution on that. But, that also applies to all sorts of regulations and laws in California. And, in California, usually and historically, I like to say there's over 3,000 brilliant ideas that are introduced every year. Now, not all of those are going to have anything to do with the trucking industry, but we're not going to let it, we're definitely, what our job is and why people join an association like ours is to provide advocacy and try and keep the government off their you-know-whats and let them just conduct business. And if there's these rules and you have to be in compliance, let's make sure that we are educating on how we can be in compliance and how we can get there. And so, like I said, on the bills that are introduced, obviously not all 3,000 have anything to do with trucking, but a handful, sometimes do. And so we, monitor and track all the bills that are introduced, and then we kind of whittle it down to see what type of impact it will have on the industry. And then we kind of develop like, okay, well, these are priority bills. These are ones that, we can work on. And so you always want guidance. You always want kind of a how-to kind of thing. And that's our job to, advocate on behalf of the industry and work with agencies or lawmakers on, hey, we need a clear understanding how these things are going to impact or how we're going to be able to comply with it.
And, with that in mind, tracking all these issues, is there an issue out there that's kind of on your radar now, something maybe folks aren't talking enough about or paying attention to perhaps out there that you think that they should know about?
You see stuff pop up. Obviously, the legislative process, the bill deadline is coming up. And so we'll have more of, kind of a clear path if there's, significant bills of impact to our members. And we go through the process of working with our members on making sure that they're involved and engaged on these things. But, it's just one of those, as far as like issues popping up, you see, what we've seen over the last few years is, some local issues popping up. Mm-hmm. We get for heavy haul members, for example, in California, there's the cost of permits, are $16 a year for single trip, $90 for annual. Like, it's not a lot of money, but each city and, county they have to follow what the state rule is for charging on that. And a lot of times what we've seen, it's like whack-a-mole, where you see these cities, they maybe don't understand or don't fully follow the state, or they're just not aware of it, and they charge quadruple that, or, they come up with these other fees. And so we see a lot of these local municipalities from time to time, and our members, they're the eyes and ears for us because we can't cover the entire state and all the cities and counties. And so when they make us aware, like, hey, this city is charging like $300 for an annual permit, which is, 5 times more than what the state is charging, you see a lot of that. And then you have to get engaged. And then you also see a lot of creativity, what I like to call creativity kind of efforts on these cities and counties where they assess another fee.
Yeah.
And then we follow up and say, well, how do you come up with that fee? Oh, well, here's the code section, our local code section. And so then you have to engage with them. And then sometimes it leads to like more meetings and possibly, you have to litigate to put a stop to these things. You also see on the local level a lot of truck parking ordinances.
Yeah.
And I believe California is historically number 1 or 2 in lack of truck parking. So, these are ordinances that sometimes are for industrial areas where trucks have always historically been able to park. And now you're coming up with these restrictions on, eliminating more truck parking spaces that are needed for truckers. And then, it's just, you try and educate these, policymakers at all levels on, hey, this is really going to impact. See it with routes. You see a lot of communities coming up with, well, I don't want these trucks in my neighborhood. Yep. So they go through the process of trying to put these restrictions on there. So it's, I think a lot of, local issues, obviously we got to pay attention to those and make sure that our members in the industry is able to safely navigate through all of these things in a more efficient manner. And it's California. There's no shortage of issues. And we can, like I said, we could spend hours talking about them.
Yeah, we certainly can. We won't keep you for hours because I know you got to actually answer some of these questions for members out there for sure. But always a lot going on there. And it sounds like that will continue here over the coming months. And hopefully we can talk to you again when something else pops up. And we appreciate having you on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Always enjoy speaking with you and appreciate what you guys do.
Our thanks once again to Eric Sauer of the California Trucking Association. For some added context, the fight does continue against those strict emission standards we spent quite a bit of time talking about, and it looks like Congress will be the one to take the baton and run with it. Representative Kevin Kiley of California, who we've had on the show before, is introducing a Congressional Review Act resolution to dissolve Advanced Clean Cars 2, which the lawmaker called California's electric vehicle mandate. If a simple majority of Congress signs off on a CRA joint resolution of disapproval, like Representative Kiley's, the regulation is eliminated, and an agency cannot come back in the future and implement any rule that is rescinded by a CRA resolution or introduce any rule that is substantially similar. So if you're not a fan of the standards that have been introduced in recent years, this is the clearest path to eliminating them altogether. Much more on this topic in the near future, but our immediate future calls for a quick break. So that's what we'll do right now. But on the other side, more Landline Now, so stay tuned.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
Landline Now. Welcome back. Members of the U.S. Senate will spend some time this week on 2 issues that have a significant importance to the trucking industry: the actual infrastructure truckers drive on, and cargo theft. Here to fill us in on what's planned, what we expect, and why it's all important is Bryce Mungen of OOIDA's Washington, D.C. office. Bryce, how are you doing?
I'm great, Mark. How about yourself?
Very well, thank you. The first hearing here is taking a look at the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I'm wondering if we could just start with just some basics, where and when. I mean, which committee is involved here, and what aspects of this law do they plan to examine?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good place to start. So this is the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, or as is commonly called, the EPW Committee. And that's the committee that's in charge of building roads, bridges, pavement, all the physical infrastructure that's part of the highway bill. So I think it's a good time to touch on, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but there's two committees in the Senate that have jurisdiction over highway bill issues, and two committees that we work with. Unlike the House side, where it's kind of all wrapped into one with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, you have the EPW Committee, and as we'll talk about momentarily, the Commerce Committee. But EPW Committee, they'll be looking at here this week on Wednesday how the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act implementation has been going. Basically, how have these programs been working? What has the feedback been? What's worked well? What can be done better? And as we've talked about a little bit this year, this is part of Congress's way of getting ready to reauthorize these programs and set new policy as part of the next highway bill that they'll be writing.
Sometimes with these hearings, you can kind of tell where the committee is headed or what they're most interested in based on who's on their witness list. So I'm wondering if you could tell us who is on the list this time, and what does it tell us about the possible specific topics that they're going to focus on?
Yeah, so there's two witnesses from public or government entities. There's the commissioner from the Georgia Department of Transportation, and then there's the deputy managing director from the Office of Transportation and Infrastructure Systems from the city of Philadelphia. So I imagine we'll be hearing questions about how has this bill worked for state governments, for local governments. How was it applying for grants? How was it managing these programs? And then there's also a witness from a construction company too. So I think we're going to be hearing some questions about how has private industry and the construction industry been able to make these programs work, or what needs to be maybe tweaked a little bit as Congress is considering changes in the next highway bill.
Obviously, anything involving the pavement truckers are interested in it. But I'm wondering if there are any particular trucking-specific issues that we expect to come up, or possible trucking-related questions that we expect some members of the committee to ask.
Yeah, at this time, I'm not sure what might come up, but I know that in the past at EPW committee, the two issues that we are concerned about, two biggest issues are truck parking, which is obviously a big issue that we're involved with across the board. And EPW committee also has, they get involved on truck size and weight issues. So those are really the two biggest issues that the committee, where they come into play on the issues we're following. But given that truck parking is such a big priority, it's something that we always have an eye on and are always watching for. Again, don't know exactly where the hearing will head this time, but in the past, senators have asked really good questions about truck parking, so we know that it's something that committee members are aware of. We've had a number of members on the committee who have co-sponsored the truck parking legislation, the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act. So that's where we'll have our eyes on this committee hearing, as well as moving forward as they're starting to talk more about highway bill reauthorization.
The second hearing there in the Senate this week will focus on a really big issue to a lot of truckers in the past few years, cargo theft. And I'm curious, because that's a very broad topic, what specific aspects of cargo theft are they expected to look at during this hearing?
Yes, so it's a relatively broad focus, but they are going to look at the rise in cargo theft, and specifically they say on crimes within the supply chain like brokering scams, fraudulent trucking companies, and train robberies by highly organized gangs. So it's kind of all the different flavors of freight fraud and supply chain fraud and crime that we've seen. I think the general public has maybe seen more of these train robberies where people are snatching stuff off stopped trains. But the fact that the committee is highlighting brokering scams, and it sounds like instances where fraudsters are stealing authority numbers or stealing other kind of identities, the message is getting through to lawmakers that this is a problem and Congress cannot ignore this problem any longer.
I tend to think that truckers think of what they call cargo theft and then these freight fraud and broker fraud problems as kind of two separate topics.
Yeah.
But it's certainly good that they're bringing up the freight fraud and the broker fraud. Do we know exactly what kinds of freight fraud outside of the broker problem that they are looking at here?
I think I can't say for sure, but I think that there is so much to unpack when you start talking about these brokering scams and basically fraudsters throughout the trucking industry. As we know from what we hear from our members and truckers more generally on a daily and weekly basis, it seems like there's always some sort of new scam that people are coming up with, which is incredibly frustrating. So I think on that issue alone, there's going to be a lot for them to cover. And I think to your kind of another point to be made is that some of the difficulty that we have in talking about this issue and trying to solve this issue is really defining it in the first place. And I think this hearing will be a good opportunity to do that, because when lawmakers or people hear about freight fraud or supply chain theft, they think about trains, or maybe they're thinking about something else. But hopefully with this hearing, there's a chance to kind of untangle some of what's going on and shine a little bit more light on what's going on in these brokering scams.
We've talked a little bit here about the fraud things that they're going to be tackling. And you mentioned earlier this problem of people stealing stuff directly off of trains.
Sure.
But for truckers, a lot of this cargo theft really is just people opening up the back of the truck and taking stuff out, sometimes in really daring and creative ways that they're stealing from these truckers and stealing from their loads. Is any of that getting attention here?
We will have to see exactly how the hearing shakes out. I imagine there's a possibility for it, considering that they're also focusing on freight that's stolen directly off of trains. I think the one thing that's been so challenging about these scams, these brokering scams, and it's a little different than physically stealing freight off of a truck, is not to minimize it, but in some ways, at least, if you know when something was taken and about where it was taken, there's kind of somewhere to start or where you can go. But one of the biggest frustrations that we've had in trying to pin down this freight fraud and brokering scams is you don't even know where to start. You say, I was scammed out of my money, or this person says they were operating here, but you track it down and it's linked to some international fraudster who's, they're gone right now. So there's just so much going on. Hopefully all the different types of fraud that that's been affecting truckers get some attention, and we can really have a good opportunity to define the problem.
Okay. Well, Bryce, it looks like we're running a little bit short on time. About 30 seconds left. Is there anything else that people need to be aware of about these two hearings?
I think just the bigger point to make as people are thinking about these hearings is to realize that so much is going on, not necessarily behind the scenes, but, under the headlines, if you will. Here's the Senate committees of jurisdiction with the highway bill holding hearings. We know the T&I committee has already held a few hearings. So now is still a great time to get involved as we're putting out calls to action, as we're updating Fighting for Truckers. So just because things might not be grabbing the headlines doesn't mean that the groundwork isn't being laid for all the issues that are very important for truckers.
Fantastic. Bryce, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
I've been talking with Bryce Mungen of OOIDA. That's our show for today. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
I'm a dad.
A son.
A husband.
Wife.
I'm a writer.
Photographer.
I farm.
I'm a veteran.
I love old cars. Fishing.
My kids.
Chrome. And I am
a professional truck driver.
And together we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us! Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit ooida.com.